Chapter 7, Part 1 of The Eight Strokes of the Clock. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lenny. The Eight Strokes of the Clock by Maurice Leblanc. Chapter 7, Part 1. Footprints in the Snow. To Prince Serge Janine, Boulevard Haussmann, Paris. Varencières, near Bassicourt, 14th of November. My dear friend, you must be thinking me very ungrateful. I have been here 3 weeks, and you have had not one letter from me, not a word of thanks. And yet I ended by realizing from what terrible death you saved me, and understanding the secret of that terrible business. But indeed, I couldn't help it. I was in such a state of prostration after it all. I needed rest and solitude so badly. Was I to stay in Paris? Was I to continue my expeditions with you? No, no, no! I had had enough adventures. Other people's are very interesting, I admit. But when one is oneself the victim, and barely escapes with one's life— Oh, my dear friend, how horrible it was! Shall I ever forget it? Here, at La Roncière, I enjoy the greatest peace. My old spinster cousin, Ermeline, pets and cuddles me like an invalid. I am getting back my color, and am very well physically. So much so, in fact, that I no longer ever think of interesting myself in other people's business. Never again. For instance, I am only telling you this because you are incorrigible, as inquisitive as any old charwoman, and always ready to busy yourself with things that don't concern you. Yesterday I was present at a rather curious meeting. Antoinette had taken me to the inn at Bassicourt, where we were having tea in the public room, among the peasants. It was market day, when the arrival of 3 people, 2 men and a woman, caused a sudden pause in the conversation. One of the men was a fat farmer, in a long blouse, with a jovial, red face, framed in white whiskers. The other was young, was dressed in corduroy, and had lean, yellow, cross-grained features. Each of them carried a gun slung over his shoulder. Between them was a short, slender young woman, in a brown cloak and a fur cap, whose rather thin and extremely pale face was surprisingly delicate and distinguished-looking. "Father, son, and daughter-in-law," whispered my cousin. "What? Can that charming creature be the wife of that clodhopper?" "And the daughter-in-law of Baron de Gorne." "Is the old fellow over there a baron?" "Yes, descended from a very ancient, noble family which used to own the chateau in the old days. He has always lived like a peasant, a great hunter, a great drinker, a great litigant, always at law with somebody, now very nearly ruined. His son Matthias was more ambitious and less attached to the soil, and studied for the bar. Then he went to America. Next, the lack of money brought him back to the village, whereupon he fell in love with a young girl in the nearest town. The poor girl consented, no one knows why, to marry him. And for 5 years past she has been leading the life of a hermit, or rather of a prisoner, in a little manor-house close by, the Manoir au Puits, the Well Manor." "With the father and the son?" I asked. "No, the father lives at the far end of the village, on a lonely farm." "And is Master Matthias jealous?" "A perfect tiger." "Without reason?" "Without reason, for Nathalie de Gorne is the straightest woman in the world, and it is not her fault if a handsome young man has been hanging around the manor-house for the past few months. However, the de Gorne can't get over it." "What, the father neither?" "The handsome young man is the last descendant of the people who bought the chateau long ago. This explains old de Gorne's hatred. Jérôme Vignal, I know him, and am very fond of him, is a good-looking fellow and very well off, and he has sworn to run off with Nathalie de Gorne. It's the old man who says so, whenever he has had a drop too much. There, listen." The old chap was sitting among a group of men who were amusing themselves by making him drink and plying him with questions. He was already a little bit on, and was holding forth with a tone of indignation and a mocking smile which formed the most comic contrast. "He's wasting his time, I tell you, the coxcomb. It's no manner of use his poaching round our way and making sheep's eyes at the wench. The coverts are watched. If he comes too near, it means a bullet. Eh, Matthias?" He gripped his daughter-in-law's hand. "And then the little wench knows how to defend herself too," he chuckled. "Eh, you don't want any admirers, do you, Nathalie?" The young wife blushed, in her confusion at being addressed in these terms, while her husband growled: "You'd do better to hold your tongue, father. There are things one doesn't talk about in public." "Things that affect one's honor are best settled in public," retorted the old one. "Where I'm concerned, the honor of the de Gorne comes before everything. And that fine spark with his Paris airs shan't—" He stopped short. Before him stood a man who had just come in and who seemed to be waiting for him to finish his sentence. The newcomer was a tall, powerfully built young fellow, in riding kit, with a hunting crop in his hand. His strong and rather stern face was lighted up by a pair of fine eyes in which shone an ironical smile. "Jérôme Vignal," whispered my cousin. The young man seemed not at all embarrassed. On seeing Nathalie, he made a low bow, and when Mathias de Gorne took a step forward, he eyed him from head to foot, as though to say, "Well, what about it?" And his attitude was so haughty and contemptuous that the de Gorne unslung their guns and took them in both hands, like sportsmen about to shoot. The son's expression was very fierce. Jérôme was quite unmoved by the threat. After a few seconds, turning to the innkeeper, he remarked: "Oh, I say, I came to see old Vasseur, but his shop is shut. Would you mind giving him the holster of my revolver? It wants a stitch or two." He handed the holster to the innkeeper and added, laughing: "I'm keeping the revolver in case I need it. You never can tell." Then, still very calmly, he took a cigarette from a silver case, lit it and walked out. We saw him through the window, vaulting on his horse and riding off at a slow trot. Old de Gorne tossed off a glass of brandy, swearing most horribly. His son clapped his hand to the old man's mouth and forced him to sit down. Nathalie de Gorne was weeping beside them. "That's my story, dear friend. As you see, it's not tremendously interesting and does not deserve your attention. There's no mystery in it and no part for you to play. Indeed, I particularly insist that you should not seek a pretext for any untimely interference. Of course, I should be glad to see the poor thing protected. She appears to be a perfect martyr. But, as I said before, let us leave other people to get out of their own troubles and go no farther in our little experiments." Rénine finished reading the letter, read it over again and ended by saying: "That's it. Everything's right as right can be. She doesn't want to continue our little experiments, because this would make the 7th, and because she's afraid of the 8th, which, under the terms of our agreement, has a very particular significance. She doesn't want to, and she does want to, without seeming to want to." He rubbed his hands. The letter was an invaluable witness to the influence which he had gradually, gently and patiently gained over Hortense Daniel. It betrayed a rather complex feeling, composed of admiration, unbounded confidence, uneasiness at times, fear and almost terror, but also love. He was convinced of that. His companion in adventures, which she shared with a good fellowship that excluded any awkwardness between them, she had suddenly taken fright, and a sort of modesty, mingled with a certain coquetry, was impelling her to hold back. That very evening, Sunday, Rénine took the train. And, at break of day, after covering by diligence on a road white with snow the 5 miles between the little town of Pompignat, where he alighted, and the village of Bassicourt, he learned that his journey might prove of some use. 3 shots had been heard during the night in the direction of the Manoir au Puits. "3 shots, sergeant. I heard them as plainly as I see you standing before me," said a peasant whom the gendarmes were questioning in the parlour of the inn which Rénine had entered. "So did I," said the waiter. 3 shots. It may have been 12 o'clock at night. The snow, which had been falling since 9, had stopped, and the shots sounded across the fields, one after the other. Bang! 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 5 more peasants gave their evidence. The sergeant and his men had heard nothing,